Tonight I'll be reading a chapter from Wilhelm Flusser's Gestures. The gesture of smoking a pipe. Pipe smokers differ most fundamentally from those who do not smoke pipes in their extraordinary dependence on pockets. At a minimum, one is needed for the tobacco pouch, one for the pipe, one for the lighter, one for the tool for cleaning the bowl, and one for the wire to clean the stem. But it is good to have additional reserve pockets, for example, for a second pipe, for matchboxes, and for wires of varying strength and flexibility. The pockets cannot just have any shape and cannot be situated just anywhere. The tobacco pouch, for example, should be in a deep trouser pocket, for it needs warmth. The pipe has to be in an outer breast pocket, for its head must be turned downward and the mouthpiece in the light. And the lighter needs to be readily available in a right inner coat pocket, so that it can be grasped easily with the left hand. The right is holding on to the pipe. Pipe smokers are distinguished most fundamentally from those who do not smoke pipes, then, by their extraordinary dependence on certain clothing. It would nevertheless be incorrect to speak of work clothes and to suppose that we could recognize a pipe smoker by his clothes. For the gesture of smoking a pipe is not work, but rather, as we shall see, the opposite of work, namely leisure. And the clothing of the pipe smoker is not recognizable as such because it is in the nature of pockets to hide and be hidden. So the following question arises. If smoking a pipe, 1. increases the smoker's dependence on circumstances and in this sense reduces his freedom, 2. is a complex gesture that does not accomplish anything as work would, and 3. does not distinguish the smoker except at the moment of smoking itself by the pipe held in the mouth. Why do some people smoke pipes? This question has the paradigmatic form of a whole class of questions. In it, for example, we could substitute painting or playing the violin for smoking a pipe. This class character of the question, which shows that smoking a pipe belongs to a class of gestures, in fact to a very questionable class, also explains why the gesture of smoking a pipe was chosen as the theme of this investigation. The question can be approached from various standpoints. One might try to explain it historically, for example, and perhaps begin with the discovery of America. One can draw on concepts from neurophysiology such as effects of alkaloids on the nervous system to explain all those psychological concepts such as phallus and vagina symbolism would work equally well. All of these explanatory efforts, and there are as many of them as there are disciplines of the natural sciences and humanities, share the need to give a cause for the pipe smoking, but causal explanations don't get to the essential thing about the gesture. When I ask why I smoke a pipe, I am not talking about the things that condition me to smoke a pipe. I mean the motive for my smoking. For I am convinced that I could just as well not smoke a pipe, and it is this conviction that makes me ask why I smoke. This difference between cause and motive, between conditioned movement and gesture, deflects causal explanations, correct as they may be, from what is meant by the question. If we are to get at what it means, the question must be answered from the standpoint where a choice was made and a decision reached. For the question means, why have I decided to smoke a pipe, of all things, instead of, say, chewing gum, which I could do just as well? Oh yeah. What is needed to answer the question, then, is not scientific research, but sympathy with the essence of the gesture. Having taken such a standpoint, we can see right away that only a complete misunderstanding of this gesture would lead to any attempt to rationalize pipe smoking. Obviously, pipes can be constructed that do not get blocked, or pipe cleaners that serve multiple functions and are easier to use, or pouches in which pipes, tobacco, and cleaners can be comfortably and economically stored. All these gadgets and more are available for purchase, by the way, but they would literally nullify the gesture of smoking a pipe. That proves that the motive for smoking a pipe cannot be the actual smoking. That is, the breathing in of tobacco smoke alone, as it may be the case with cigarette smoking, and that the pipe smoker does not have the same relationship to nicotine as the cigarette smoker. One might even suppose that the actual inhalation of tobacco smoke is in part just an excuse for the complex gestures that precede and follow it, and that the motives for smoking a pipe are at least as likely to lie in these complex gestures as in the actual smoking. This begs a comparison. Isn't the difference between smoking a pipe and smoking a cigarette comparable to the one between drinking tea at breakfast and drinking tea in the Japanese tea ceremony? To the extent it is apt, the comparison raises a suspicion that pipe smoking is largely a ritual gesture. Of course, pipe smoking is not done at the same sacred level as the tea ceremony, to say nothing of ritual gesture in the Roman Catholic Mass or rain magic. We are surprised to realize that there is no overall norm governing the behavior of pipe smokers. This is to say not only that each pipe smoker has worked out a characteristic way of handling his pipe, but also that each pipe smoker is prepared to confirm and defend his style in discussion with other pipe smokers. The observation is surprising because it appears to contradict the first observation. For isn't it the mark of a ritual gesture that it is stereotypical, that is, prescribed and rigid, so that anyone performing it must make the same movements always and anywhere? And doesn't their readiness to discuss and confirm their own style mean that each pipe smoker believes himself to have rationalized his gestures? On reflection, one gets the feeling that the contradiction that has come to light here does not block the way to our understanding of pipe smoking and ritual in general, and may actually open it up. For what we have before us in this contradiction is the insoluble fusion of theory and practice, as it occurs in ritual and in no other activity. What characterizes gestures such as pipe smoking is, on one hand, that they are completely impractical, in the sense of having no intention of achieving anything, and on the other hand, that they are completely practical in the sense of having no theoretical basis. So with this kind of gesture, there is no dialectic between theory and practice, of the sort that came to light in the analysis of gestures of work. Rather, there is that insoluble fusion exposed in the contradiction we encountered. Pipe smoking's complete impracticability appears in this contradiction as a struggle between opinions regarding the best way to smoke a pipe, in which all the contestants realize that the issue is subjective. For when there is no intention of achieving anything, there can be no objective best method of smoking. And pipe smoking's complete practicality appears in the contradiction as a variety of smoking styles, that is, aesthetic rather than epistemological variations of the same theoretically incomprehensible activity, stereotypical, after all. In other words, the discussion is now completely theoretical and has no effect on the theory-free gesture of smoking, nor, strangely, does it want any. It arises nevertheless wherever and whenever pipe smokers meet, because the absence of theory for smoking, in light of its complete indifference to practice, presents a kind of scandal for the smoker himself. As mentioned earlier, pipe smoking is a profane gesture. So the completely ineffectual theoretical discussion between pipe smokers regarding different styles of smoking is enveloped in an atmosphere of smiling mutual tolerance, Because smoking is profane, which is to say it has no bearing on the essentials of existence, each smoker lets another achieve bliss in his own way. Of course, he remains convinced all the while that his is the right way, for the only reason that applies here, namely, that it is the one that makes him happy. Turning from this entirely ineffectual theoretical discussion of a gesture that cannot be theorized to other rights, which are concerned with existentially foundational, namely sacred matters, the atmosphere changes. So, exactly on the basis of its profanity and so its pervasive harmlessness, pipe smoking may serve as a model for the understanding of the discussion of rights within orthodoxy. Whether the tobacco should be pressed into the bowl firmly first and then lightly appears as a question of the same type as one about whether one should eat an egg that has been laid on a Saturday. They are at once completely theoretical questions in the sense of being completely free from any intention of achieving anything, and not theoretical at all in the sense of being directed only towards practice. It shows that such discussions cannot and don't want to rationalize the right, but rather are aesthetic in the etymological sense of the word, namely that they are concerned with experience. And it shows that the kind of reasoning that comes into play in such discussions is neither theoretical nor practical, but rather a kind specific to discussions of rights. In the Jewish context, it's called pilpul. This indivisible union of theory and practice and ritual, in which theory is no longer theoretical and practice no longer practical, rather than theory becoming practical and practice theoretical, as is the case with work, already came into view with the contradiction between the first and second observations regarding the gesture of smoking a pipe. Although pipe smoking is a stereotypical activity because it cannot be rationalized and does not try to achieve anything, each pipe smoker smokes in his own characteristic way. And the question it comes down to is, of course, what the concept stereotype means. If by stereotypical behavior we understand a gesture whose every separate phrase is more or less pre-planned, then it is clear that with pipe smoking, we do not have a stereotypical form of behavior. But in this sense, no gesture is a stereotype, for inherent in the concept of gesticulating is the typically human belief in acting of one's own free will, and this belief instills a plasticity within the structure of the gesture. Stereotypical behavior in this narrow sense is more readily observed in animals than in people. For example, in the dance of bees, in the way the male fish courts females, or in the nest building of birds. And when such behavior is observed in people, it often has a pathological, obsessive character. Pipe smoking is not like this, and it would be an ontological error to call the dance of bees or an obsessive handling of pillows a ritual. Stereotypical behavior in the narrow sense is a phenomenon on a level of being for which natural science is competent, and rituals are a phenomenon of another level of being beyond the competence of the natural sciences. If by stereotypical behavior we rather understand a gesture whose general structure is stable, and that is performed so as to realize this general structure, without pursuing a purpose that refers to things outside the structure, then pipe smoking is stereotypical behavior. For now, the word stereotype means that there are gestures that are made largely for their own sake, and for which we have models. When we gesticulate in this sense, we don't do it to change the world as we do with work, or to convey a message to someone as we do with communication, but to perform movements within parameters established by a model. And that is what we do when we smoke a pipe. It does not exclude the possibility of changing the world, for example, burning tobacco, or communicating something to others, for example, the smell of the tobacco. But it would be an error to suppose that the changing the world and communicating aspects of any gesture explain stereotypical gestures such as pipe smoking, and this error blocks access to an understanding of such gestures. Rain magic is not explained by considering it a means of producing rain, or by claiming it is a particular community's method of communication. One only gets closer by recognizing it as a behavior that incorporates a particular model. Nothing essential is said about rain magic by comparing it with other methods of producing rain or other means of communicating, but only by drawing other stereotypical gestures, such as pipe smoking, into the comparison. For then it becomes clear that we are basically dealing with a question of style, an aesthetic question. It becomes clear that ritual is an aesthetic phenomenon. What has just been said is a daring assertion, for it contradicts almost everything that has been said so far in the subject literature. The risk must be taken anyway, because an observation of pipe smoking almost demands it. For in trying to enter into the gesture of pipe smoking from an ethical angle, the characteristic thing about the gesture is lost, and that characteristic thing is the ritual aspect. So the crucial aspect of a rite cannot be its ethical aspect. For example, making rain or transforming the host into the body of Christ. And the announced intention of the rite when it is being performed, for example, success in hunting or purification, must be conversely something considered that covers up the essential thing as a rationalizing pretense, which is incidentally imminent in most rites. When someone says he smokes a pipe to inhale tobacco smoke, he believes what he is saying. And the same is the case for the claim of taking communion to save the body of Christ, and washing one's hands to keep them clean. But despite the plausibility of such claims, they are mistaken. In fact, pipes are smoked, and communion taken, and hands ritually washed to perform a gesture within an available behavioral model. This can be seen more readily in pipe smoking than in other stereotypical gestures because it is a profane gesture and so relatively free of ideology. This leads to the following consideration. The less intentional a gesture is, the less it pursues a goal outside itself, the purer is the ritual. The intention, which transcends the ritual gesture, could be called its magic aspect. The magic element in rain magic is the intention of producing rain, and in the rite of communion is the intention of transforming the host into the body of Christ. When the question is put in this way, magic does not appear inherent to the rite, but conversely is a debasement of pure ritual. Then it becomes clear why the Jewish prophets opposed all magic so violently. They wanted a pure, purposeless rite, an unpractical practice. And Judaism then appears as a partly failed attempt to develop a model for gestures of pure ritual, a life of impractical practice. Even with this, however, we still have not come to the essential thing about smoking a pipe and about ritual life in general. It only comes into view when we reflect that we are dealing with an essentially aesthetic phenomenon. The assertion that pipe smoking and ritual gestures in general are aesthetic phenomena is risky, primarily because it puts the question of art in an unfamiliar light. What is unfamiliar about the assertion is not the claim that art is a kind of rite, but just the opposite, the implication that ritual is a kind of art. This is not the usual claim that the artistic life is a life form, along with the political life, the scientific life, or the religious life, or even that the artistic life is aligned under the religious one, Kierkegaard. It is rather that the unfamiliar claim that religious life, inasmuch as one understands it to be a ritual life, is one kind of artistic life form. This unfamiliar claim does not mean a sanctifying of the artistic life, but conversely, the desanctifying of ritual, for it was reached through the observation of profane pipe smoking. Obviously, what has just been said assumes that such words as art and religion are to be questioned, for it may be that the whole difference lies in the definition of these two concepts. Whether we are concerned with verbal difference only, or with a difference in meaning, can only be decided when the gesture of smoking a pipe, which offered the starting point for the risky assertion, is illuminated by observation. For through such observation it should become clear what is meant by art and religion. Let's turn back to our original question then. Why do some people smoke pipes despite it being a gesture that neither achieves anything like work, nor distinguishes in any way like communication? To move closer to an answer, we should turn our attention to the way the question is framed, implicitly distinguishing among three kinds of gestures, namely the gestures of work, gestures of communication, and gestures of the type pipe smoking, which were defined as ritual gestures. Assuming that being expresses itself in the world as gesticulation, the question's framing implies that it would be possible, based on gesticulation, to distinguish three life forms: working, communicative, and ritual being. Such a classification conforms neither to Kierkegaard's, which I just mentioned, aesthetic, ethical, religious life, nor to Plato's economic, political, theoretical life, as it was elaborated by Hannah Arendt. Still, the divergence should not be taken too seriously, for we are not concerned with a phenomenal classification, and any one of us constantly performs gestures of all three types, and each type possesses aspects of the others. We are there, in other words, in simultaneously stylizing ourselves with respect to the world, work, to others, communication, and to ourselves, ritual. The question about the reason some people smoke pipes is a special case of the question about why ritual gestures are performed, and further contains the question about the reason these gestures, rather than others, are ritually performed. The answer to these two aspects of the question seems obvious: for pure pleasure. Many people smoke pipes because they take pleasure in this particular gesture. It pleases them to interrupt other gestures, such as writing an essay or talking to a friend, to take their pipes apart, clean the bowl with old nail scissors, then run the stem through with a hairpin, put the two parts back together, pull the pipe pouch out of a pocket, crumble the tobacco between the fingers, push it carefully into the bowl, take the pipe between the teeth, get the tobacco to glow with a slow rotation of a specially constructed lighter, draw the tobacco smoke into the oral cavity, and then resume the interrupted gesture of writing or conversation. It pleases them to share their attention between the gesture now resumed and that of pipe smoking, and it pleases them to have their attention to the gesture of writing or conversing immersed in the specific mood of pipe smoking. It pleases them that smoking a pipe, a gesture subordinate to the other one, demands that they interrupt the writing and the conversing repeatedly. It pleases them that when they have finished smoking, they must clear the pipe out, blow through the stem, and rock the pipe between the hands so as to cool it, so that it can be stored in the breast pocket. They take a kind of anticipatory pleasure in being able to choose among various forms of pipe and various qualities of tobacco in specialty stores, and it pleases them that they can prefer a particular shape of pipe, for example short or curved, and a particular kind of tobacco, for example bitter, cut fine. They are pleased that they can build a pipe collection, designate some pipes for daily use and others for special occasions. The list of these joys, all small, could continue for a long time, and the length explains why, despite its joys being small, pipe smoking is one of the pleasures that many people would not want to give up. This somewhat long-winded answer to the question is completely inadequate, however, for instead of actually answering the question, it opens a whole range of new questions. Just for example, what is pleasant about cleaning the pipe bowl when it is in fact a distinctly unappetizing procedure? Or why is it a pleasure to interrupt writing a conversation when there is greater interest in continuing to work and communicate? And basically, what is meant in this case by the word pleasure when we seem to be dealing with a burdensome gesture, a kind of vice? Isn't the essence of vice passion, that is, suffering? And isn't there suffering when the pipe is blocked up or one runs out of tobacco? To say nothing of the fact that pipe smoking is detrimental to health. The pleasure in smoking a pipe does not have one or another specific cause, and does not come from resisting one or another argument against it. Rather, the pleasure comes from the gesture, from acting oneself out. This phrase, in everyday use yet difficult to grasp, touches the essence of pipe smoking. In this context, to act out does not only mean to expend superfluous life energy to no purpose, although it means that as well. This as well can be observed in pipe smoking. But to act out also means to project an existence that is one's own, very particular and comparable to no one else's. This meaning of the phrase act out can be observed in the gesture of pipe smoking. It is important to note that the verbs to act out and to let oneself go are not synonyms but antonyms. In letting go, the self is lost in unstructured movements that no longer constitute gestures because they are not performed freely. In acting out, the self is recognized as if from the outside and so asserts itself, for it is then performing a gesture specifically for itself. This antinomy between acting out and letting go can be observed in pipe smoking. For in smoking a pipe, a person moves as a function of specific, freely chosen objects, that is, within boundaries, in a manner that bears witness to his own existence. That is what brings pleasure, to bear witness to oneself freely and without purpose, within explicitly chosen parameters, to recognize oneself by one's style, and then to immerse all other gestures, for example that of writing and that of conversing with a friend, in this style. From this standpoint, perhaps we can appreciate the familiar saying about style making the man. In other words, pipe smoking is a gesture that permits us to act out, that is, to find ourselves in the world through our own style. And that is what is meant by the answer. It is a pleasure. This kind of pleasure can only be defined as aesthetic. And so we can now say what was meant by the word art when we were discussing ritual gesture as a phenomenon of the artistic life. The word art means the gesture through which existence acts itself out, freely and purposelessly bearing witness to itself within appropriate parameters. The artistic life, then, is the life form that depends on the style in which gestures are performed. So the artistic life is not about changing the world, or about being in the world with others, but about finding itself in the world. The gesture of pipe smoking is a nice example of this sort of life, because in most other examples of artistic life, for example, dancing or praying, issues of changing the world or seeking others weigh in the balance, but in pipe smoking they play hardly any part at all. As we will see, the gesture owes its aesthetic purity to its profanity. What comes to mind in speaking of the artistic life is not likely to be the gesture of pipe smoking, but rather such gestures as making sounds, photographing, or writing poems. Why, actually? If the artistic life is that form of life in which people act themselves out, then shouldn't it be such gestures as smike poping, pipe smoking that come to mind when it is under discussion. Our misrecognition of what is essential about the artistic life goes back to the way the concept of art has developed in Western history. In the West, art has become a kind of work aimed, as all work is, at producing something, a work. It has even become the highest kind of work because it is expected to be creative, that is, to produce new works. At the same time, however, art in the West has become a means of communication that shares something with another person, as does all communication. It has even become the highest form of communication because it is expected to be original, that is, to share new information. Because of these developments, the essential thing about art, namely the aesthetic acting out, has been suppressed. And so, when talk turns to art, thoughts do not ordinarily turn to such gestures as pipe smoking. In other words, the historical development of the West has caused the essence of artistic life to be forgotten. It can be recalled to memory, however, for example, by looking at the art of Black people. One could claim, namely, that the gestures considered expressions of artistic life in Black Africa and America, drumming, dancing, and mask carving, that is, recall our pipe smoking far more readily than our painting does. What happens when a mask is carved can be described as follows. To perform his gesture, the carver has specific materials, specific tools, and a specific model available. In this sense, his gesture is stereotypical. Now, he does not attempt to work with a new material or experiment with new tools or exceed his model, as a Western sculptor would. Rather, he tries to express his own specific character within the framework of the materials, tools, and patterns that are given. This art is therefore not, as we sometimes tend to think, a static, inflexible repetition of forms, but a context in which individual styles come to expression, perhaps more often than in Western art. And this may be because the models for the gestures are accepted as boundary parameters. Exactly because this art is not historical in our sense of the word, it permits the realization of individual style rather than changing the world or communicating. In this sense, it is a purer art than that of the West. Now, it is often claimed that African art is an aspect of religious life. One drums so as to move the gods to enter human bodies. One dances to drive spirits out of bodies. And one carves masks to make these dances more effective. Here we are dealing with a misunderstanding. It is in fact true that drumming, dancing, and mask carving can be used for magic, that is, for religious purposes as well. But it is not true that these gestures serve such purposes exclusively. It is not true that African art serves magic. What is true is the opposite. Magic is one of the possibilities African art offers. African art is its own purpose. One drums because one finds oneself in this gesture. The fact that this drumming causes a god to enter a human body is in fact a result of the drumming, and is impossible without the drumming. But if the drumming was done solely to achieve this, then it was not pure. African art opens its space to magic, but magic is a result, not a cause, of the artistic life. That permits us to come closer to what is meant by religion. To drum, to invoke a god, is to carry out a gesture of the artistic life. For within the set boundaries of drums, sticks, and rhythm, it expresses an individual style. Apparently, drummers recognize one another across the hilltops of Rio de Janeiro at night, just by the way the drum is struck. That is to say, a person finds himself in his own drumming as it flows out from the self into the world, but it is exactly this self-recognition in the world that challenges the god to descend. In the final analysis, the god does not appear in the rhythm of the drum, but in the self-recognition achieved by means of the aesthetic gesture. The god is an aesthetic phenomenon, meaning that he is one of the experiences one has when acting oneself out. In drumming, a person experiences himself in ecstasy from beside oneself, as rhythm, sound, oscillating nerves, and an ordering principle dominating the environment, and also as a god. Those are various kinds of experiences in the artistic life. One can, of course, concentrate on one of these kinds, on rhythm, on sound, on the god. Each of these forms of concentration will result in a variation of the gesture of drumming. If I am interested in rhythm, then I will drum differently from the way I would if I were interested in the god. But the variations overlap, for the god is an aspect of rhythm, and the rhythm is an aspect of the god. But if we call the interest in God a religious interest, then we are obliged to see the religious life as a variant of the artistic one. That was what was meant by the word religion in the context of claiming religion to be an art. It meant that only in the artistic life does a space open for the religious life at all. I don't have religious experience in the gesture of work because in this gesture I experience the world, that is, I experience knowledge. And I don't have religious experiences in the gesture of communication, for in this gesture I experience society, which is to say I experience values. Only in the aesthetic experience can I have a religious experience. For in this gesture I experience myself, that is, I experience revelation. Science is a possible result of work. Ethics and politics are possible results of communication, and religion is a possible result of art. This assertion can be backed up theoretically, derived from many biographies, and documented in history and prehistory. But the crucial thing is that it can be seen in the gestures themselves. Observing the gesture of pipe smoking, we can see that a space within the artistic life opens up to the religious life. And it is possible for us to see it because we are dealing with a profane gesture. The gestures of smoking a pipe, carving masks, and drumming are all stereotypical and therefore depend on style. They are aesthetic gestures. The gesture of carving a mask differs from the other two in achieving something, namely the mask. This, the gesture's extension into the area of work, makes the gesture of carving a mask into an aesthetic gesture of the type artwork. The gesture of drumming differs from the other two in sharing something with the others, in signaling some information. This, the gesture's extension into the area of communication, makes it into an aesthetic gesture of the type message. The gesture of smoking a pipe differs from the other two in having no intention outside itself. The purity of the gesture of smoking makes it into an aesthetic gesture of the type ritual. The fact that mask carving is directed against a material, drumming toward others, and pipe smoking toward nothing should not disguise the aesthetic character of all three gestures, for all depend on the style, that is, on acting out. And yet the mask carving and drumming, by extending themselves into areas that are not aesthetic, to change the world and society, so transcend the two gestures as to present something of a distortion of the pure artistic life, a distortion toward the magical. Mask carving and drumming are magical aesthetic gestures. That is, they are geared in part toward changing the world and conveying messages. Magic can be defined in this way. It is the extension of the artistic gesture into areas that are not artistic. Real work is not magic because the aesthetic moment is not decisive in it, as it is in magic. Real communication is not magic because it is not primarily a question of style, as it is with magic. Pure ritual is not magic because the ritual gesture does not extend beyond the area of the artistic life. So there are gestures in the artistic life that are not magical, namely gestures of pure ritual. In the life of the African, there are many magical gestures because Africans lead largely artistic lives. In our lives, there are relatively few magical gestures because we suppress the artistic life in favor of the lives of work and of communication. We have defeated magic by subordinating the artistic life to work and communication, and in doing so, obscured the concept of art. But it is possible to defeat magic in other ways as well, namely through a purely ritual life, which is to say an artistic life that does not transcend itself. The gesture of smoking a pipe, among other things, demonstrates this. The gesture of smoking a pipe is not magic, but this is not the reason it is profane. It is profane because although it is an aesthetic gesture, it opens no space to the religious life. It is in fact pure ritual, but not a ritual that permits the God to be experienced in it. The magical gesture of drumming permits it. One might think it was the magical aspect of the gesture that opens the religious space, but the God appears in the drumming not because it is evoked because of magic, but because drumming is a gesture in which the drummer finds himself as a god. It is not the magic dimension of the drumming that opens the religious space, but the purely ritual. But why does this space not open in the pure ritual of pipe smoking? Answer: because pipe smoking is a ritual in which the smoker does act out, but to which he does not give himself completely. So the pipe smoker does recognize himself in the gesture, but only insofar as he expresses himself in it. That is not enough to have a religious experience. The religious level lies so deep that it can only be experienced if the ritual gesture mobilizes one's entire being and not just one of its aspects, as is the case with pipe smoking. Drumming is sacred not because it is magic, but because in it being is expressed completely. And pipe smoking is profane not because it is not magic, but because it is too superficial to express being completely. When he is smoking a pipe smoker is living aesthetically. But his smoking takes place within a life of work and communication that is not aesthetic, while writing or conversing. This is what makes pipe smoking profane. It is a pure ritual that takes place within a meaningful life. It's true that in itself pipe smoking is meaningless and cannot be rationalized, that any attempt at a rationalization actually ruins it. But this, the absurdity of pipe smoking, is not part of the pipe smoker's existential foundation. That is why pipe smoking is a profane gesture. Drumming is sacred, but not actually because it is meaningful, that it means to evoke a god. It is sacred because it is fundamentally absurd, and because the drummer is fundamentally absurd in it. Magic only appears to be work and communication. Fundamentally, it is an absurd way of working and communicating. The magic aspect of drumming disguises its absurdity, but it is the absurdity that makes drumming sacred. Pipe smoking is not sacred, although it is absurd, because its absurdity expresses only an aspect rather than the whole of the smoker's being. If you try hard enough to find your way into it, you can tell from the gesture of smoking a pipe that the absurdity of the ritual almost requires you to open up to religious experience. If you observe the way pipe, tobacco, and smoking tools are manipulated, with what kind of consideration the separate moves are performed, and the way the smoker remains aware of the absurdity of these moves all the while, you feel as if you are moving along the outer edge of what is meant by a religious experience. A small step would be enough to go beyond this edge and fall into the void. A small step as it is taken in a tea ceremony, or better yet, in pipe smoking, in an umbanda ceremony. The structure of the gesture of the tea ceremony is almost identical with the structure of the gesture of smoking a pipe, and the gesture of smoking a pipe while one is writing cannot be distinguished at all from the gesture of smoking a pipe during the umbanda. In other words, in smoking a pipe, one gets the feeling that a very slight impulse would be enough to transform it from a profane into a sacred gesture. So we can see, just because the gesture is profane, how any ritual gesture opens a space for the religious experience. You can tell that the rite is a sacrament exactly because the tamping, cleaning, and lighting of the pipe have nothing whatsoever to do with religious experience. You cannot recognize the sacramental so readily in sacred rites, such as in folding the hands, crossing oneself, or turning toward Mecca to pray, because the view is obscured by a rationalizing ideology. The various religious ideologies idealize their rites, deny that they are absurd, and in this way hide what is essential about them. Pipe smoking exhibits its absurdity openly, because it is still just barely profane, and so permits us to recognize the absurd as the essence of the sacramental. By way of pipe smoking, we can recognize the essence of ritual life, to be open to religious experience through purely aesthetic, that is, absurd gestures. It will be apparent to anyone who has ever made such a gesture that we recognize ourselves in them, and only in them, only in piano playing, only in painting, only in dancing does the player, the painter, the dancer recognize who he is. It is a founding principle of Zen Buddhism that self-recognition can be a religious experience if the recognition is of the whole self. Its rituals, tea drinking, flower arranging, board games are therefore sacred rites. Suddenly, the greatest discovery of Jewish prophecy is that religious experience is an experience of the absurd, the groundless, that God is manifest as that which is inexplicable, indefensible, good for nothing else. Hence its battle against magic and its insistence on the absurd rite, with no aims that make any sense. But all these noble insights, those of the artist, the Zen monk, and the prophets, can be gained in a modest and profane way by watching such everyday gestures as pipe smoking with sufficient patience. For then it becomes clear how each of us is a virtual artist, and a virtual Zen monk, and a virtual prophet. For each of us performs purely aesthetic, absurd gestures of the same type as smoking a pipe. What also becomes clear, of course, is what sets most of us apart from real artists, Zen monks, and prophets, namely the complete renunciation of reason in the sense of explicability and purpose, and the unconditional surrender in the gesture and to the gesture essential to the real artist, the real Zen monk, and the real prophet. The question at the beginning of the essay was, why do some people smoke pipes when it limits their freedom, accomplishes nothing, and shares nothing? The first answer that was offered was for the pure pleasure this gesture affords. Now it is possible to make this answer somewhat more precise. Some people smoke pipes for the same reason some people are artists, others monks, and still others prophets, namely to act themselves out and find themselves. It's just that pipe smoking is far less demanding than a gesture of art, and even less demanding than the artistic gestures of Zen monks or Orthodox Jews. This also makes it far less open. So some people smoke pipes as a kind of substitute and caricature, which is to say, a profanation of a ritual life. Thank you. And reader's note, vaping is not an aesthetic gesture.